it's interesting that recent President Zelensky statements, he said that only Vladimir Putin's death can bring the war to its end. But do you see that Putin is the main obstacle to peace? Because there are many more Russian hardliners who are in favor of continuing the war against Ukraine, who are also playing with public opinion in Russia to also to rise this opinion in favor of the war.
Well, I think it's difficult to say what exactly the situation would be without Putin's insistence. I mean, what's interesting, I think, at the moment is that despite discussions around the ceasefire, Putin has not modified his war aims at all. It's absolutely clear that he still wants to reduce Ukraine to a vassal state of Russia and have the country demilitarized. So there's no compromise apparent at the moment on his side. And I think the problem for Putin is he has no, well, the way I would describe it is he has no reverse gear on his policy. He's so committed to this conflict. He can't really go backwards. So the question is, if he were not there, what other individuals would come forward? But if they did, would they have support? Would the Russian people follow? I really have my doubts as to the sort of sustainability of the military conflict without Putin's leadership.
You just mentioned that it is difficult for Putin to try to find a way out from this situation. Does this mean that he cannot really find this way out from this war? He can't reverse his policy because there's interesting opinion that he has sacrificed too much in this war. I mean, human losses, economic losses, that he just simply cannot reverse his war. He cannot end this without achieving his main aims.
Well, if you remember where this started in February, well, I appreciate the war's much longer than that, but the invasion from the north in February 2022, I think the expectation of Putin and Putin's leadership and the people around him was that the war would be over in weeks, and that they would capture Kyiv and then dominate the whole country. 3 years later, they've expended so much that it's very difficult now to go backwards. I mean, what we would say in English is that, he's in a very deep hole and he's still digging and he's going on digging. And for example, although he has sort of said, well, maybe we'll consider a ceasefire and then come up with one or two minor proposals, there's no evidence at all at the moment that Russia is serious about a ceasefire. And he is just stringing the Americans or Trump's administration along, saying, well, maybe yes, but meaning no in terms of his reaction and his activity.
You just mentioned that Vladimir Putin still continues his policy. He cannot reverse it. Moreover, recently he said that Russian army would be able to finish off the Ukrainian army. However, Russian army couldn't do this throughout these 3 years of full-scale war. Don't you think that Putin is overplaying his hand by promising achieving such maximalist goals, but he doesn't have any ability to capture the whole army, finish off Ukrainians?
Well, it's very hard to imagine after 3 years of conflict that the Ukrainian military, which has been remarkable in its performance, is going to, as it were, fold its cards and give up. I just don't believe that. I think there is a worry, though, on the Ukrainian side, which is the threat that Trump may start withdrawing support. And one saw the impact of that when cooperation was briefly ceased and the Russians moved to take back some of the Kursk, the salient. So I think what's important from Kyiv and Ukraine's point of view is that there is sustained military support. The American element is very important. Okay, Trump has threatened maybe to stop that, but so far that hasn't happened. And what we need to know is what Trump will do if Putin refuses to move in the direction of a ceasefire. I mean, the only bit that he's proposed is a ceasefire in the Black Sea, where the Ukrainian naval capability, this extraordinary use of new technology, has pretty much driven the Russian Navy out or to the far side of the Black Sea back to their bases. And it's a remarkable naval achievement.
Also, in your article for The Telegraph, you noted that Trump has two options to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to provide Ukraine with military support or also to impose sanctions against Russia. However, you just said in your interview that neither option will deliver a result which will match Trump's impatience to achieve a quick ceasefire. Does this mean that even if Trump uses all means of pressure on Putin, it will be not enough to actually end the war?
Well, the answer is there's so much uncertainty about Trump's reaction, what he'll do next. I thought it's very, very hard to predict that. I mean, the reason I wrote that article, which I hope is widely read, particularly read in Washington, is to try to get across the point that there's there's a real danger in doing a rapid ceasefire deal because Russia is in a deteriorating position. And actually, the longer the war, in my opinion, goes on, the more that Putin plays into Ukraine's hands, as long as support for Ukraine is sustained. And I think there's a new important element in this is a new German Chancellor, Merz, and a possible changing attitude on the part of Germany, where Merz will be much more willing to arm and to support the Ukrainian military. That won't replicate what the Americans do, but it could make a significant difference. So the important thing here is that Ukraine really does, in my opinion, need to hang on and to push Russia to the point where these stresses begin to show results. The other issue, which is, I think, vitally important, and we see the effects of this already, is Trump's policies are reducing the price of energy, oil and gas in particular, and this has a very detrimental effect on the Russian economy. And there is a further point which I made in that article about what I would call secondary sanctions. If the United States were to ramp up secondary sanctions, by that I mean sanctions on the countries, that's primarily India and China, who are buying Russian energy, this would make a huge difference to, it would speed the weakening of the Russian economy.
Let's cover also this intention of Trump for a quick ceasefire deal. Steve Witkoff, after the meeting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, proposed Trump to support this Russia strategy to give up 4 Ukrainian regions to Russia, according to Reuters. What such plan would mean for global security if it is being implemented by Trump?
Well, I can't see Ukraine agreeing to surrender its territory, even if the territory is occupied by the Russians. So I think what one would be looking at, and I'm sort of giving you a practical outlook here, is a line of truce. I mean, so there's no technical end to the war, the conflict, but you have a division. And I think at the moment we have to face up to the reality that's probably the point at which the conflict may cease for a period of time. But of course, it is a situation which would be precarious for European security. and there would be significant concern. So I don't think any of the European powers are going to agree to the surrender or the loss of any territory. But as I said, you have a line of truce in between North and South Korea, for example, and that is the last truce line of the Cold War. Without an agreement, and it's possible to envisage some sort of situation which might correspond with that in Ukraine.
Also, let's cover current split in the White House. According to today's article in the Wall Street Journal, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and also retired U.S. General Kit Kellogg are trying to convince Trump to be more tough on Russia. However, on the other hand, we have Steve Witkoff, who is advising Trump to move forward with this quick deal. He's confident that Vladimir Putin will agree to full ceasefire. What is your assessment of this split in the White House and two groups of people who have really different opinions? Is there a chance that they would have one single united approach to this war?
Well, I think there is. I haven't seen any evidence myself, and I'm aware that there may be a difference of opinion. I've done a podcast with Rubio. This was a long time ago, and Rubio's expressed view is pretty clear cut on the importance of supporting and continuing to support Ukraine. And one of the points that Rubio made in discussion with me, and I've heard him make it with other people, is that, Trump does not want to have an Afghan-type disaster occurring at the beginning of his presidency, so that, you look at the impact that had on Biden's reputation as president. It was very, very damaging. So I am of the view that, there isn't yet a clear policy line, which is encouraging in a way, because it may mean that Trump's previously expressed view is being modified and changed. I think the other leader who met Trump and probably argued with him very logically and strongly about the danger of making concessions to Russia was when the Finnish Prime Minister Alex Stubb went to the States, and of course had the advantage, he's a very good golfer, playing golf with Trump. And that conversation was widely reported. So, what I find interesting at the moment is that Trump has not moved to make concessions to Putin. Okay, there have been discussions which indicate that he might, but they haven't actually happened. And I'm sure there is this debate going on. And if Putin shows no willingness at all, which is the case at the moment, to accept a ceasefire or to compromise at all on his war objectives for Ukraine, they're completely unmodified, then the likelihood is that, Trump does have to toughen his stance and toughen his position.
Also, he has been threatening sanctions, secondary tariffs against Russia. However, it seems also that he is providing Vladimir Putin with lots of time. He is not setting any kind of a quick deadline for this. What is the reason why Trump is has a so friendly stance with Putin and giving him a lot of time for this decision on a full ceasefire?
Well, in a way, I think I've argued that an early ceasefire is not to Ukraine's advantage. So, but look, Trump has got, he's done an awful lot quickly, and a lot of it's been done spontaneously without it's difficult to detect, where there's a plan, where there's a strategy. And at the moment, there's huge preoccupation, as you're well aware, with the tariff issue and the relationship with China and the modification of that and the chops and the changes, the negotiations. My experience of, which is quite extensive, of dealing with the US government is that one crisis at a time, and you've got an ongoing crisis over tariffs, is about as much as any administration can deal with. I think, in a way, as I've said already, it's to Ukraine's advantage that there isn't a hasty deal, because Russia, in my book, is in a vulnerable situation, and we need to help Ukraine to hold the line. I mean, the cost in this conflict to Russia, I was looking up the statistics in the last month, and Russia's advance militarily has slowed. The losses on the battlefield for them are over 40,000 casualties and deaths, over 5,000 pieces of military equipment, hardware. This is huge, and Ukraine is basically being very successful, not necessarily at holding territory all along the line, but in wearing down the Russian military effort. And the other point which is important to consider is what impact a further mobilization on the Russian side will have politically in Russia. Bear in mind that the people who pressurized the Russian leadership during the war in Afghanistan were Russian mothers, and they are a potent political force in Russia if the cost becomes unacceptably high. And the recruitment now, which has been in the sort of non-Russian parts of Russia, in the rural areas where families have been paid a lot of money to bring in more soldiers, we're reaching the point where he's going to have to recruit in Russian urban areas, and this politically will have a huge impact in Russia, in my view.
You just mentioned about Russia's mobilization. Vladimir Putin has just called up another 160,000 young men as in a conscription campaign. He said that they will not fight in the war against Ukraine. However, if he decides to continue war against Ukraine, if he rejects a ceasefire proposal, do you think that he will be forced to conduct another round of full-scale mobilization?
Well, absolutely, because the battlefield casualties, the fatalities, have been at catastrophic levels. So these military resources, these human resources, have to be replaced. And because of the controversial nature in Russia of mobilization, and particularly in urban areas closer to Moscow, this becomes more and more problematic politically. And of course, a lot of the Russian elite, a lot of these young people who might risk being called up, I mean, large numbers have left the country. They've gone, places like Georgia, where it's relatively easy to get into those countries, they have left. And there's no question that this is another stress factor operating on the Russian nation as a whole. And these stresses now are really beginning to bite and to count and to make a difference.
I know it's really difficult to have the full information about Vladimir Putin's inner circle, but do you expect this stress also to rise among Russian generals, security services officials, and Kremlin's officials? Do you feel that the security and military groups around Vladimir Putin are in the support, would like to support ceasefire, or would like to continue the war?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because, frankly, we don't know. But if we sort of speculate, and it is speculation, there must be people around Putin, particularly amongst the military leadership, who are very, very concerned about the cost of this war and the inability of the Russian military with all of its vast resources and its vast numbers, to defeat the Ukrainian military. That's clearly not going to happen. I mean, you already are very close to a situation of stalemate. And, you know, our perception of what was the Russian military, or going back further, the Red Army, has been changed totally by this conflict. You know, it hasn't been able to achieve what many people would have thought for that military capability a pretty straightforward objective. It's failed.
Let's also cover the coalition of the willing. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron and other European leaders are working to conduct this mission in Ukraine after a full ceasefire. What is your personal opinion about this concept and this plan about the coalition of the willing?
Well, I have serious reservations. I don't really understand what the thinking is behind this, because the frontier between Russian and Ukrainian forces is so long. Are we talking about military units which would police that frontier? I mean, talking to my own military contacts, one is speculating that you would need a force of 200,000. I mean, it's a huge measure, a huge business. So what does is the coalition of the willing who are going to continue supporting and backing Ukraine in this conflict? I don't see what a on-the-ground deployment would be, and the Russians, of course, would be very, very reluctant to see NATO troops policing a line of conflict or between the two armies. So I think if one is trying to sort of speculate and think about what might be practical, I think that the more likely possibility would be air cover provided as a security guarantee for Ukraine. That might possibly, but even that is difficult to imagine because of, you know, would it be a NATO engagement? Would it be, as it were, individual countries working not under NATO command? So in my book, the only possible alternative might be some sort of air cover, which of course would be a huge security guarantee and very important. But beyond that, I'm not party to these discussions, and it's, I think, very difficult to imagine exactly what they amount to. I think we have a NATO summit coming up in The Hague in June, and I think maybe after the NATO summit, it will be easier to have a picture of what's being planned.
And my last final and quick question, do you expect, can you imagine such air cover over Ukraine without full ceasefire?
It wouldn't be possible without a ceasefire. I mean, that would be, as it were, a security guarantee following a ceasefire. And I think then this raises the whole issue. And I mean, I think for the moment, being pragmatic, being realistic, you know, NATO membership for Ukraine is a very long way away.
Thank you, Sir Dearlove, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, I think it's really important that the West and Europe in particular continues to support Ukraine in every way possible. And I'm very proud of what the UK has done to support the Ukrainian military effort.
Thank you.